So I'd like to welcome everyone to another broadcast of the North Carolina Masonic Research Society. And tonight we are thrilled to have back the one and only Mitch Horowitz. Mitch really astounded us about a month and a half ago with a presentation on Manly P. Hall and the secret teachings of all ages. And now he's back to talk to us about Hermeticism and his presentation, Hermes Resurrected. I'm really looking forward to this. I think we're all familiar with Mitch being a prolific author, author in residence at the New York Public Library, lecturer in residence at the Philosophical Society in Los Angeles, documentarian. You have a documentary on Kabalyan that's filmed in Egypt. Should be coming out soon.
Yes.
Really looking forward to that. So Mitch is just all over the place. So it's really an honor when he's able to spend some time with us. So Mitch, welcome. We're glad to have you, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate it. This is the second presentation that I have done recently with the North Carolina Masonic Research Society, and I feel very privileged to be speaking to y'all. I think this is a topic that is very dear and close to my heart. And it's an opportunity to speak about the manner in which we as contemporary seekers in the 21st century have an actual veritable connection to the philosophies and the ideals that animated folk in the ancient world. And I would say that those connections they're real, they are authentic, they're also thin and tenuous. They don't present themselves in a ready-made, easily disclosed fashion. They require a certain degree of searching and a certain degree of understanding. And I hope that what we are able to do here tonight contributes to both. The idea is not to get lost in fantasies about our connection as contemporary seekers to the ancient world. It's very difficult for us to get a full visceral sense of what our ancient ancestors were thinking about, how they lived, their motives, their needs, their problems, even the events that animated their day-to-day lives are things that we can only grasp at fragments of, at threads of. And yet, at the same time, to deny that we have some parallel concerns with our ancient ancestors is to deny the consistency of human nature itself. Not only do we have parallel concerns, but I think it's fair to say that there exist certain parallel insights between philosophies of the ancient world and philosophies of our own contemporary age. When I say parallel insights, I mean that it is sometimes the case that people who are separated by vast stretches of time, geography, language, and custom sometimes do come to a common set of insights. And when that occurs, I think that puts us on the scent trail of truth. I think when we have insights that coincide with the insights of people from whom we're separated by vast circumstances, it suggests something of a universal truth. It suggests something of a core conceptual, philosophical, ethical, spiritual quality and axis of human nature and of the human search. Moreover, there are instances, and you can find this within the Hermetic literature, which we're going to be talking about tonight. There are instances in which some of the insights of our primeval ancestors have actually come down to us in a thin, fragmentary, thread-like way and inform our own search and our own philosophies in the here and now in ways that are not just matters of parallel insight or coincidence, but are an actual family tree of connection. And that's why the Hermetic literature is so valuable, because in some respects, it may be the one body of philosophical writing in our world today that ties us directly to the concerns of seekers, initiates, philosophers, scribes, who lived in the impossibly distant and yet in some ways still present empire of ancient Egypt. I want to start by just giving a basic description of the word Hermeticism. And why is this word in our lives today? What do we mean when we say that someone is a hermit, or that something is hermetically sealed, or that something is very hermetic if we mean to describe it as being mysterious in some way? Why should the term Hermeticism, why should this reference to the ancient Greek god of writing and intellect, Hermes, why should this be current in our world today at all? You know, sometimes I'm fascinated by the manner in which retentions of ancient wisdom or ideas or concepts appear in our world in ways that are almost by osmosis, so that we don't even recognize that they're here with us. You know, we will randomly, for example, make reference to what sun sign we were born under in the zodiac wheel. And although that's a kind of everyday thing, it's extraordinary to me that such a notion would have survived into the 20th and 21st centuries. One could ask, why should this retention of ancient Babylonian and Persian astrological study practice, which was remade within the Hellenic and finally the Roman world, why should it have reached this at all? Why should you know whether you're a Sagittarius or a Libra or a Cancer and know something, about the traits of those signs? It's remarkable the manner in which certain things will linger. And Hermeticism, or the term Hermetic, is one of those terms that has lingered. Obviously not with the same degree of popularity as certain variants and remakings of astrology, but it has lingered, and it's a term that one hears. So what does it actually mean? At its base, the term Hermeticism, as we use it today, is a product of the encounter between ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. In the latter centuries of ancient Egypt's existence, the nation was dominated to some extent, first by Greek, Hellenic military campaigns, economic pressures, cultural influences, but later, going into the age of the rise of the Roman Empire, following the military campaigns of Alexander the Great in the final centuries of the pre-common era, Egypt became a protectorate of Rome, basically, a colony of Rome. And although Egypt was subjugated by Roman military force in the generations immediately preceding Christ, the ruling class remained a Greek overclass, basically. Then this Greek overclass used the Greek language, conducted a lot of the military and economic business of ancient Egypt, and thought of itself as Egyptian, admired, venerated, in many cases sought to preserve Egyptian culture, statuary, architecture, philosophy, religious traditions. But this Hellenic ruling class, this Greek ruling class, was an intermarrying, a kind of governmental and administrative class whose seat of power was in the city of Alexandria, of course named after Alexander the Great, the Greek conqueror. And it saw itself still as Greek in background, if Egyptian in culture and consciousness. Cleopatra herself, whose reign began about around 51 BC, was Greek. And Cleopatra was actually widely venerated by everyday Egyptians, who sometimes very deeply resented Greek encroachment on Egyptian life, because she was very dedicated to the revival of Egyptian mystery traditions, initiatory traditions. She was, I'm not going to say a unique figure within the Greek ruling class, but she certainly was a figure who venerated Egyptian religion, culture, philosophy so deeply that she, as a ruler, as a Greek ruler, at least by lineage, was probably a figure from the Alexandrian ruling class who associated more closely than any other with her Egyptian surroundings. And she did a great deal to revive some of the fading, what at that time had been fading temple orders within Egyptian life. So she became universally venerated within these final generations, final centuries of what we consider to be ancient Egypt. And this, in some regards, is where our drama begins, and is where the term Hermetic emerges from. Here's the scene that I've pieced together. The ancient Egypt, in its final centuries, was under the yoke of Roman military occupation. Its ruling class was a Greek and Greek-speaking administrative class that was based chiefly, at least as its epicenter, in the city of Alexandria, from which the nation was ruled. The most famous and the most dramatic figure to emerge from this Greek ruling class, the potentates of whom were called Ptolemies, which was a term general, although Cleopatra, as a woman, was an exception to that term was not used to describe her. Cleopatra emerged from this Ptolemaic class and became one of the most beloved figures in the latter stages of the Egyptian Empire, because of her efforts to revive Egyptian culture and mystery traditions and so on. So gathered around Cleopatra, and in the decades that followed Cleopatra's reign, including the decades that immediately followed the death of Christ, there emerged a group of Greek scribes in the city of Alexandria who did something that was unprecedented in Egyptian history up till that point. In the decades immediately preceding and following the death of Christ, Greek scribes in the city of Alexandria began to write down ancient Egyptian religious philosophy and esoteric religious insight into the Greek language. Now, Egypt, of course, had its own written language of hieroglyphs, and hieroglyphs had a phonetic counterpoint, although this phonetic counterpart was really lost to a very great extent to Westerners after the fall of the Roman Empire, and it wasn't rediscovered until really about the dawn of the 1700s, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, and some of the archaeologists that he brought with him discovered what is called the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was basically a document etched in stone that had a text that was in hieroglyph, Greek, and Demotic, which was a language used in the Mediterranean basin in antiquity. So the phonetic counterpart to hieroglyphs, and in essence, basically the meaning of hieroglyphs, was really lost to modern Westerners until late in the age of Napoleon. So the point is, the Egyptian language of hieroglyphs, while it was a language in every way that we understand a language to be today, it was also at the same time heavily symbolic in nature. It didn't have the same expository quality that we understand in languages today, a basic subject, verb, object syntax that allows us as 21st century Westerners to easily understand something. There was a phonetic component, but it wasn't expository in the same way that the Greek language was an expository language. So it was a unique pivot point in Egyptian history and in Western history that this group of Greek Egyptian scribes in the city of Alexandria began to write down in an expository Western language, Greek, the rites and rituals, traditions, and esoteric insights of ancient Egypt as they encountered it at that time. And these Greek scribes engaged in a practice that was fairly common in antiquity. And that practice was, instead of signing their own name to this literature, they affixed to this literature the name of a god to give it greater gravity. And that god was Hermes, the Greek god of writing and intellect, or, as they also put it, Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus, meaning thrice greatest Hermes. This was a term of veneration that Greek scribes and scholars used to refer to Thoth, ancient Egypt's god of writing and intellect. Thoth was an ibis-headed god who, actually you can see an image of Thoth on the cover of this book, about which I'll say more a little bit later. Thoth was a man god with the head of an ibis and was often depicted holding a stylus, a writing instrument, which this figure was using to inscribe hieroglyphs onto a clay plate. When the Egyptian Greeks encountered the figure of Thoth, Egypt's god of writing and intellect, they felt that this figure predated, in a sense, their own god of writing, Hermes, and was so much greater than their own god of writing, Hermes, that they deemed Thoth thrice greatest Hermes, 3 times as great as Hermes, Hermes Trismegistus. So when they wrote down the philosophies of ancient Egypt, they often affixed the name Hermes or Hermes Trismegistus to this literature to give it greater gravity, to give it greater authority. Ancient scribes sometimes would affix the names of Moses or Abraham to various writings, even many centuries past what we consider the biblical era, because again, the thought was that you were lending the piece of writing a greater weight, gravity, and authority. This is what later became known as the Hermetic Literature, so named because it was signed with the name of Hermes, or Hermes Trismegistus, who to the Greeks was basically a higher, greater, more significant version of the Greek god Hermes. And so there was a vast array of written literature that we refer to as Hermetic. Some of this literature dealt specifically with spells and ceremonies and magical operations. This became called, by modern people, technical Hermetica. Some was concerned with veneration, offerings to, devotions to specific gods, and some of it, which later came to light during the Renaissance era, became known as the Corpus Hermeticum, the Corpus Hermeticum. The corpus consists today, basically, of 17 tracts, 17 books that I would say capture some of the most significant spiritual psychology of the ancient Egyptians. The Corpus Hermeticum is a subset of the Hermetic literature, which on the whole is referred to as the Hermetica. The Corpus Hermeticum is the Hermetic literature that came to light during the Renaissance, about which I'm going to speak. And it formed our basic conception of Hermetic philosophy. Although again, there were thousands of Hermetic tracts. Some of them have survived, some of them have not survived. Some of them, as I was saying, deal with specific spells and ceremonies, and some of them are more specifically philosophical. Many, though not all, of the surviving philosophical tracts are grouped into what we call today the Corpus Hermeticum. Now, there have been several long-standing controversies about the Hermetic literature. The most contentious of which is the question of whether the Hermetic literature should be considered Egyptian at all, or to what extent it can be considered Egyptian. There have been scholars, particularly in the mid-20th century, who argued that the Hermetic literature is more a product of Greek thought than of Egyptian thought. That within the Hermetic literature, you find ideas and phrases that could be associated with Neoplatonism, a kind of esoteric, mystically inclined movement that postdate Platonic philosophy by many centuries. And some scholars argued that the Greek ruling class was really such an isolated pocket within Egyptian life that its writing, its literature really didn't capture authentic Egyptian thought, much of which is lost to us, at least insofar as some of the traditions of personal development are concerned. And that way of thought has actually given way, has shifted in the late 20th and early 21st century. Most scholars today believe that, in fact, although Hermetic literature does have some Greek and early Western influences, it is more closely attached to ancient Egyptian thought than critics have previously understood. There have been a wide range of scholars who have made that case. Martin Bernal in his book, Black Athena, Gareth Fowden in his book, The Egyptian Hermes, which is an outstanding book, and a variety of others. And I think that this is an extremely important point to understand. And I think that understanding the authentic Egyptian nature of the Hermetic literature is almost a matter of understanding the manner in which our religions and our philosophies develop in general in the world, all over the world. And that is that most esoteric, religious, and ethical philosophies that have come down to us from antiquity began as oral tradition. In human history, as in the development of individual humans, speech has always preceded writing. The great myths of the world, Vedic myths, Persian myths, Greek and Roman myths, they all began as oral tradition. We all know the name of the great Greek poet Homer, but what Homer was really doing was, in essence, the same thing that Plato himself was doing, which was adapting and writing down oral tradition. Oral spoken form, initiatory practice, rite, ritual, and ceremony have always preceded writing in human life. Story and the passing of wisdom from the ear of listener, of speaker to audience, of teacher to initiate, is generally agreed upon as the starting point, the foundational point for almost all of our ancient written literature. And this is true in human life as well, of course. An infant learns to speak before much later on, around age 5, 6, that child begins to write. This is basically a universal human truth, but it's true within the historical development of most of our religions. And we see religions borrowing from one another all the time. Religious history is basically combinative, syncretic history. The early Jewish people borrowed certain ideas, participated in certain ideas that were held by different groupings and sects that could be found in the Mediterranean basin. Christianity itself, built upon Judaism, Christianity inherited ideas and holidays from Persian and Hellenic tradition, from a variety of pagan traditions, which later turned into contemporary holidays that we refer to as Christmas and Halloween and so forth. And there's a constant repurposing of the family tree of religious ideas throughout human history. So the fact that these Greek Egyptian scribes were writing down Egyptian initiatory ideas would fit the paradigm that replays itself throughout human history of people adopting, readapting, re-rendering ideas that came from a much older point. We always build one on top of the other. We rarely start foundations anew. So I think that there were probably late ancient innovations within the Hermetic literature, but the Hermetic literature itself, I think, can be defended as authentically Egyptian in nature. In fact, considering that oral tradition usually serves to pass along ideas, especially in ancient cultures that didn't have other forms of media than very largely than architecture and oral tradition, bas reliefs and so forth. Very often, the passage of ideas from mouth to ear can extend back hundreds of years. So I think it's not a stretch to contend that what you find in the Hermetic literature is a retention of some very authentically real and ancient Egyptian ideas. And it's extraordinary that it's come down to us in this slender time capsule that we refer to as the Hermetic literature. And I want to say something about what's actually found within the Hermetic literature. But before I do that, and I'm going to try to get very, very practical with you, because we're here tonight not only to explore history, but also to inquire about the practical, spiritual, psychological applications of Hermeticism. So I want to take time, and I'm going to be very careful to take time to get into some very practical ideas with you. But before I do that, I want to say a quick word about how this literature vanished, how it came back to light, how it very nearly vanished again, and why we're so fortunate to have a precious few translations of this Hermetic literature today. Because I would contend that the Hermetic literature is an authentic time capsule that has reached us from ancient Egypt. And as a piece of primeval wisdom, as a piece of foundational spiritual wisdom, the Hermetic literature holds for us ideas that are applicable and real in the here and now. And before I get to that, I want to say something about the serpentine path that Hermetic literature took. So this literature was written down in the decades and generations immediately following the death of Christ in Alexandria. And I'm making historical leaps here, given that we have a fixed period of time. But as the Roman Empire in what we consider, what we call the West, traditionally speaking, came apart, and as Roman rulership disintegrated within the Mediterranean basin, within the biblical lands, within Western Europe, it certainly persisted within parts of Persia for much, much longer. But as Rome's military colonization and governmental apparatus disintegrated in the Mediterranean, all the countries that had been under Greco-Roman domination drifted off in a variety of different directions. As Europe entered the centuries of chaos that are popularly known as the Dark Ages, the Hermetic literature, as with many written forms of ancient wisdom, of pre-Christian wisdom, basically vanished from view. Order in terms of administrative governance, taxation, control of civic life was increasingly maintained by the Catholic Church and by regional potentates, and the Hermetic literature was rarely heard about, referenced, or known of. And as with many ancient manuscripts, it was probably spirited away into monasteries where it was kept for safekeeping, but largely invisible to the eyes of all but a very, very few. But there was a remarkable turnaround in the story and the drama of the Hermetic literature, which occurred around the year 1462. In the year 1462, or sometime thereabouts, according to what records we have, a Byzantine monk entered the royal court of the Florentine leader Cosimo de' Medici. And this monk, who was probably in the employ of Cosimo de' Medici, entered the royal court at Florence with a cache of ancient Greek manuscripts. And these ancient Greek manuscripts were, at that time, probably about 14 in number. And these were pieces of the Hermetic literature. And Cosimo was absolutely thrilled and overwhelmed because the Hermetic literature, it was heard of, it was known, the name Hermes Trismegistus was spoken of as a kind of legend, but nobody had any of it, or if they did, it was only fragmentary. And here was this Byzantine monk entering Cosimo's court and bearing with him in what probably amounted at that time to about 14 manuscripts, 14 scrolls, this actual Hermetic literature, which had been heard about in legend, but wasn't possessed, seen, or read. And Cosimo and his court scholars and translators were absolutely thrilled, because there was a belief that was very central within the Renaissance mind, within the minds of scholars and theologians and scribes, translators, that there existed somewhere out in the world this pristine early theology, this primeval theology that predated Christianity, that predated Judaism, that predated whatever was known at that time of the religions of the East, the Vedic traditions, and that this primeval theology held the key to humanity's earliest insights into the workings of the cosmos, into our psyches, into our nature and purpose as human beings. And so the name Hermes had been heard of. The idea of this primeval theology, this theology that predated all else, had been spoken of, had been dreamt of, had been theorized about. And lo and behold, here in the year 1462 was this journeyer, this monk, who seemed to be handing these manuscripts over as if handing over a turnkey to this ancient primeval theology. Hermes Trismegistus was regarded by Renaissance thinkers, by many Renaissance thinkers, as an actual being, as a kind of great ancient being who might have been a contemporary of Moses or a contemporary of Abraham. Hermes Trismegistus was thought of in the Renaissance as a kind of mythical man-god, not quite human, not quite deific, but this magical, extraordinary, legendary teacher, this great higher adept. And here was literature that bore the name of Hermes Trismegistus. So Cosimo directed one of his court translators, Marsilio Ficino, to stop the work he was doing translating Plato from Greek into Latin, to stop that, and instead he told Marsilio to translate this Hermetic literature, which was in Greek, into Latin. Latin was still the language used by rulers, administrators, the learned class. This language from the Roman Empire was the chief language that was used among educated and administrative figures throughout Western Europe. So if you wanted a document to be available to teachers, theologians, and so forth, you would translate it into Latin. So Cosimo was very eager to read the Hermetic literature before he died. And in fact, he did die about 2 years later. So he told Marsilio Ficino to discontinue the work he was doing on the Platonic dialogues and to direct his attention, his full attention, translating the Greek Hermetic writings into Latin, which Marsilio did. And what was discovered was an extraordinary spiritual psychology, a psychology that described the individual human as a kind of capillary of divine influence. And in the same way that the divine mind, the higher mind, what the Greeks called nous, what the Hermetic Greeks referred to as nous, could create by thought, so could the individual create by thought within his or her own sphere. And the notion was that everything that happened within our physical day-to-day existence is a mirror of things that are happening on concentrically higher planes of existence. And a thought that exists within your psyche can enter and begin to rise through these concentric circles of existence and actually affect the circumstances of life and the concrete realities that we feel and that we experience within the realm that we dwell within. The great maxim of Hermetic philosophy is as above, so below. It's a term that does not appear, at least in that form, in the manuscripts that we call the Corpus Hermeticum, the manuscripts that Marsilio translated. It is a term that appears in a different document called the Emerald Tablet, which is a work of Hermetic literature for which we have not found the Greek equivalent. We have Arabic versions that go back to the 8th and 9th centuries AD, very late antiquity. And we have Latin versions, but we have not found the Greek original. So for some time, there was a debate as to whether the Emerald Tablet, where this phrase as above, so below appears, should be considered Hermetic literature, although most scholars today do believe that it is legitimate Hermetic literature. These late ancient versions were found in the 1920s, and I think it's very convincingly theorized that there are earlier Greek counterparts that have just been lost. But the point that I'm trying to make is the phrase as above, so below is the central ethic, the central principle, the central insight of Hermetic literature, that everything that we experience is mirrored by events in dimensions that are unseen to us. But in fact, everything that we experience is also mirrored in other ways in our lives, things that we participate in, that we think, that we say, that we do, all have their own mirror opposite, perhaps unseen in a physical sense, but felt in terms of the actual concrete experiences of our hourly existence. And if one understands that, one begins to see the mind as much more than a tool of just cognition or analysis or motor skills. As crucial as all those things are, the mind is also a creative element, a creative agent. The Hermetic philosophy would argue that because there are these other concentric circles of existence that can be penetrated by thought and that extend to nous, or this highest creative mind, that does not necessarily mean that you, the individual, are situated at the lowest sphere of those concentric circles. There might be a whole series of concentric circles that emanate from you. So the release of a thought has the possibility to affect life in a whole wide range of symbiotic ways. Again, as above, so below. As above, so below. Don't think of yourself as necessarily being above or necessarily being below. Part of the human search of self-knowledge is to try to gain a glimpse of where we might be within this schema of concentric circles. We're not necessarily at the top, or we wouldn't experience mortality, for example. But we're not necessarily at the bottom either, because we're capable of creating within our own cosmic framework. And what we create might be felt by other people or in other strata of life in ways that we're not fully aware. I'm going to say more about this, but I want to make the point that the symbols, the ideas, the gods, the philosophies that emerged from this Hermetic literature, which became known as the Corpus Hermeticum, wielded a tremendous effect throughout the Renaissance world. Of course, Christianity was the dominant religion by leaps and bounds within Renaissance Europe, but the Hermetic literature opened up a whole occult revival within the Renaissance world. The term occult comes from the Latin occultus, meaning unseen or hidden. Occult was very simply a term that Renaissance writers and thinkers began to use to describe the Hermetic world, to describe the ancient world of temple orders and mystery traditions that had vanished. And when they sought a kind of catch-all term, a term other than Hermetic, to describe all the various rites and rituals and philosophies and practices of the ancient world, they seized upon the Latin term occultus, hidden, unseen. And using aspects of Hermeticism, aspects of ancient Greek Egyptian thought that had gotten preserved in the so-called technical Hermetica, some of which was in Greek, some of which was in Arabic. Renaissance philosophers began to experiment in and write about this occult philosophy. And Cornelius Agrippa, in the early decades of the 1500s, wrote his Occulta Philosophia, 3 books of occult philosophy, which really became the cornerstone and the urtext of most occult practice and ceremonial magic today. He was drawing himself upon older documents, including an Arabic document called the Picatrix, from which he derived much of his astrological writing and methodology. So you had this renaissance of occult thought, of interest in ancient Egyptian, ancient Greek Egyptian philosophy, in alchemical symbolism, much of which was derived from the technical Hermetica, in a spiritual psychology that was found within the Hermetic writings. And all of this ignited the Renaissance mind in a vast and wide-ranging form of shapes and influences and ways. However, the Renaissance fascination with the Hermetic literature began to hit an ebb tide. And the ebb tide came in through the work of a French linguist named Isaac Casaubon. In 1614, which was really already in the waning days of what we would consider the Renaissance, in 1614, Casaubon wrote a textual analysis of the Hermetic literature, and he made the observation that there was language and usage in the Hermetic literature that time-stamped it to late antiquity. It wasn't necessarily understood during the Renaissance that the Hermetic literature was produced in Alexandria in the decades following Christ. We understand that today, but our Renaissance counterparts did not necessarily understand that. They believed these manuscripts to have a vintage of deep, deep primeval antiquity. And maybe it's a flaw in human nature, maybe it's a flaw in our thinking styles in the West, but we tend to associate antiquity with authenticity. We believe that the vintage of something is a kind of key as to its worth or its value. Again, Renaissance thinkers were very aroused with this idea of there being a pristine primeval theology that predated everything else. And that if you could get to this, you could get to the very foundations of spiritual thought and of the insights, the cosmic insights of our earliest ancestors. So when Casaubon made the case very persuasively that there were terms, forms, and usage within the Hermetic literature that time-stamped it to late antiquity, that began a gradual unraveling of the importance that had been attached to the Hermetic literature. It's important to understand that this unraveling didn't happen all of a sudden. You know, I think one of the ways in which we misinterpret history is that we think in terms of turning points. You know, we like to think in terms of years, 1492 and 1776, and here's when something begins and here's where something ends, in the same way that we Westerners get very turned on by vintage. We also get very turned on by the idea that there are these neat lines that demarcate history, and that isn't really how things work. The philosopher, the historical writer Martin Bernal, who I love, whose book Black Athena I highly recommend, he made the point that for about a century later, people were still quoting from the Hermetic literature. So it's not as if it fell into disfavor like the switching on and off of a lever, but Casaubon's analysis did dash the hopes of Renaissance and late Renaissance thinkers that this stuff was really, as old as any written form itself. It did dash those hopes, and it contributed to an eventual undoing of the importance that Western thinkers placed on the Hermetic literature. So, by the following century, the Hermetic literature was a curio. It wasn't talked about. It was not commonly referenced. It was thought of as something that had no place in the Age of Enlightenment, in the Age of Reason. It was thought to be old-fashioned, of no real value, of no real historical value. And this was a great tragedy. This was a huge mistake in the development of modern Western intellectual culture. The mistake was, and I was referencing this earlier, because Casaubon had determined through textual analysis that the Hermetic literature dated to late antiquity, a lot of people, albeit over the course of time, made the mistake of thinking that because the original dating, because the original vintage had been wrong, that the ideas themselves were somehow fraudulent or inauthentic. They weren't the real McCoy. They were artifice. And this was a huge mistake, which caused Western thinkers for a very, very long time to overlook the fact, even as we had no grasp of the meaning of hieroglyphs or the pronunciation of hieroglyphs, to overlook the fact that we did actually possess a time capsule, a retention of ancient Egyptian thought, for some of the reasons that I was referencing earlier. Oral thought, initiatory tradition, always precedes written form. And what the Greek Hermetic writers were doing was setting down oral tradition that had survived many, many centuries across the span of the Egyptian empire, and that they were, for the first time, writing down. It did not mean that the ideas themselves were new. They certainly were not. It only meant that the Greek form in which they were committed was new, if we can speak in such a way of late antiquity. The Greek form in which they were written was late ancient. The ideas themselves extend back to a period of time at which we can only guess, but it's almost certain, given the nature of how oral tradition develops and its persistence and the revival of the Egyptian initiatory traditions under Cleopatra, we can only, and I think very justifiably, assume that we're dealing with a retention of profoundly ancient writings and ideas. But this was misunderstood. This was misunderstood once the antiquity of the manuscripts themselves was dispelled. Hence, coming into the modern age, there were very, very few English translations of the Hermetic literature. You know, very often when I talk to people about the Hermetic literature, the attitude is, wow, we have this retention of ancient Egyptian thought. This is incredible. Where is it? Let me at it. You know, I'm ready. But the truth is, until very, very recently, and when I say recently, you know, I'm talking about, you know, going back into the 1990s or so, we really did not have quality translations of the Hermetic literature. We had some very, very late Renaissance translations written in English that was turgid and flawed and probably inaccurate. We had some very thickly written Victorian and late Victorian age translations, the best of which is probably from a 3-volume set called Thrice Greatest Hermes, published by G.R.S. Mead, who was a secretary to Madame H.P. Blavatsky in 1906, post-Victorian, but very turgidly written, very, very tough to get through. We had very, very few reliable, scholarly, and also pristinely written translations of the Hermetic literature. Isn't it incredible? You know, we have translations of Homer, of Aristotle, of Plato, of various myths and legends in the Greco-Roman world. And here we had this extraordinary time capsule of Greek rendered ancient Egyptian philosophy from late antiquity. And it was neglected, it was overlooked, it was considered artifice, all because of a controversy over the dates, but without understanding that the dates are secondary to the actual historical depth of the content. Now, in our current world today, in the here and now, we do have we do have a couple of really quality translations of the Corpus Hermeticum. One of which was produced, and I really think that this is a great breakthrough, and I recommend it to everybody. One of which was produced in 1992 by a scholar named Brian Copenhaver. It's called simply Hermetica. And this was published by Cambridge University Press. This is an absolutely vital, essential translation. It's quite expensive, but I recommend it. It's worth every penny. This translation contains the Greek Corpus Hermeticum, the manuscripts that were translated from Greek into Latin during the Renaissance. And it also contains another Latin dialogue called Asclepius. And this Latin dialogue, Asclepius, is another of these Hermetic dialogues for which we've never found the Greek original. But it's widely considered an authentic ancient piece of Hermetica, and it's very often grouped with the Corpus Hermeticum. And it's very beautiful, and I'm going to say something about it further in a little while. Another translation, which I recommend, was published by Inner Traditions, and it was published around 1999 in Great Britain, 2000 here in the United States. It's called The Way of Hermes, The Way of Hermes, by a scholar named Clement Salomon and a team of collaborators. Also absolutely outstanding. I recommend, personally speaking, seeker to seeker, that you get both. Hermetica by Brian Copenhaver is really, really good because it has an outstanding historical introduction, really worthwhile. And I think that his introduction does a really good job of contextualizing Hermetic thought as authentic ancient Egyptian thought. The Way of Hermes doesn't have, I would say, the same quality of historical introduction, but it's a very, very beautiful translation, and it's a very highly regarded translation. I personally think you should get both. You can find translations online including the translation by G.R.S. Mead. I love G.R.S. Mead, and he's kind of a hero to me because he was a brilliant, self-educated man who, through his dedication to occult studies and his own high scholarly standards, rescued the Hermetic literature from obscurity in a post-Victorian age when there really were no decent translations. You can find the Mead translation online, and if it speaks to you, that's wonderful, but it's written in a very thickly worded late Victorian prose that I don't think is very effective for the 21st century reader. So I admire him as a pioneer, but I think that his work as a translator has been surpassed. And we are lucky, because I must tell you, until the early 1990s, there just weren't decent translations. This is new. This is something that really belongs to our generation. We're so fortunate to have actual, real translations of the Hermetic literature that you can get your arms around. And I believe that for that very reason, it falls to us as a generation to experiment with these ideas and to ask ourselves, what possibilities do Hermetic teachings, do these ancient Greek Egyptian teachings hold for you and me as seekers today in the here and now? And this is where I want to turn my attention away from history and more directly towards the practical implications of the Hermetic literature. Now, if you sit down and read the Hermetic books, as I hope you will, in the translations that I've identified or in other translations, you will find, first of all, that the Corpus Hermeticum today consists of 17 books. It was originally 14, but things got shuffled in and shuffled out. And basically today, what's called the Corpus Hermeticum is 17 books. However, Hermetic literature is never simple. Why should anything in life be simple? There's a phantom text missing. Book 15 is missing. Where is book 15? Where is the mysterious book 15? Book 15 was a book called the Suda, S-U-D-A, the Suda. And the Suda was a dialogue that depicted the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, this legendary man god, as a kind of prophet who foresaw the rise of Christianity. And there were a lot of early Christian writers who did believe that the Hermetic literature foresaw the emergence of Christ in Christianity. But the Suda was later identified as a document that was most likely from the medieval period and not a piece of actual ancient Greek Hermetica, so it was removed. But in most translations, and you'll see it in the Copenhagen translation and others, the Hermetica is still numbered tracts 1 to 18, with tract 15 missing. So, you're left saying to yourself, where exactly is tract 15? And I try to be very plain about explaining these things because I feel that college instructors and translators and people who write introductions are not as clear and as plain as they should be. I recently published a book called the Kabalyan Study Guide. I'm going to say a word about the Kabalyan in a little bit, because that's really a work of pseudo-Hermetica, but filled with brilliant insights. And the author of the Kabalyan was drawing upon the meager Victorian translations that were available, and I think he distilled brilliant insights from what was available to him. I wrote a book, which is out now, called the Kabalyan Study Guide, where I try to explain very, very clearly, this is where the Hermetica came from, this is how it reached Western life, this is why it vanished from Western life, and some of these issues, such as, where is tract 15, can be explained easily, and yet for some reason our pedagogical culture in the West sometimes resists explaining things in plain language, and I do what I can within my own sphere of influence to try to redress that. So anyway, if I ruled the world, The Hermetica would be numbered 1 to 17, but I don't rule the world, so it's numbered 1 to 18, with 15 just missing, and very few commentators actually clarifying where 15 is. 15 was deemed a latter-day edition that got mixed into the original and was taken out. In addition to the actual 17 Hermetic books that we have, there's the Latin book Asclepius, which is a dialogue between Hermes Trismegistus and one of his disciples, Asclepius, and I'm going to say more about that. Again, that is in Latin. We don't have the Greek original. We don't know where it is. The other tract that's really important and that you can find translated online is the Emerald Tablet. The Emerald Tablet is where the maxim "as above, so below" appears. That was translated into English, actually, by Sir Isaac Newton, and you can find that very easily online, and it's a wonderful translation. The Emerald Tablet might be considered a piece of technical Hermetica because it's a very short alchemical text, but this notion of "as above, so below" appears within the Emerald Tablet, and that phrase is the central foundational philosophical pivot point of Hermetic literature, and you'll find it expressed in different language in various Hermetic books. You will not find the Emerald Tablet grouped with any of the translations that I've described to you, for the simple reason that for a long time, scholars debated whether it was the real McCoy. Is it a real piece of Hermetic literature, or is it some latter-day innovation? But with the discovery of the earlier Arabic versions from the 8th or 9th centuries, which again happened in the early 1920s, most scholars today do regard the Emerald Tablet as an authentic piece of Hermetic literature. So if you want to, I was going to say, here's the deal. I sound like Joe Biden. Here's the deal. If you want to study Hermetic literature in terms of its philosophical ideas, what I encourage you to do is get a hold of one or both of these translations that I had put up on the screen, read books 1 through 17, read Asclepius, which is grouped with them, read the Emerald Tablet, which you can find online, translated by Sir Isaac Newton, among others. And I'm also going to recommend that you read the Kabalyan, which is a modern book published in 1908, because the Kabalyan, about which I'm making a documentary with the director Ronnie Thomas, and we shot part of it in Egypt last year, the Kabalyan is not just a novelty, is not just a piece of pseudo-Hermetica. I don't use that term in a negative way. It's a real insightful distillation of some of the psychological ideas that appear in the Hermetic literature. So, what are these ideas? I alluded to some of them earlier. The basic premise of Hermeticism is based on the principle "as above, so below," insofar as we are the creations of a great higher mind, which the Hermetic Greeks called nous, so can we create within our own cosmic framework, within our own physical framework. Within the Hermetic Dialogues, particularly in books 1 and 11, which I think are the most mystical books that you'll find in the Corpus Hermeticum, within the Hermetic Dialogues, you will find this encouragement to think of yourself as equal to the gods. Not because you are equal, but because you are in the evolving process of becoming equal. And within the Hermetic literature, we are taught that the aware individual, the individual who understands the creative capacities of his or her own mind, actually strengthens the presence and the existence of the ancient gods in his or her life. The awareness of your abilities as a cosmic thinker, the very awareness itself, serves to strengthen the influence that you feel from higher concentric circles of existence. This is very similar to an insight that was arrived at by the American philosopher William James in the early 20th century in an essay called Is Life Worth Living, which he published in 1905. James made the observation that he saw no reason why the very act of faith itself did not strengthen the effects and the influences of a higher power or greater force within the life of the individual. The very act of belief itself is not just something that serves to convince by suggestion, but it serves to actually open the aperture of influence for that which is believed in. As above, so below. Now, I believe that when our primeval ancestors observed the workings of the world around them, they were very keenly tuned in to the forces, the qualities, the energies, metaphorically speaking, but maybe not quite metaphorically speaking, of nature. And they personified these energies. They bestowed names upon these energies. They called them things like Zeus or Aphrodite or Set, which I have a papyrus scroll, an original papyrus painting of over my shoulder. And they sought relationships with these energies. They sought actual petitionary relationships with these personified energies. And I think that we modern people have neglected to fully experiment with that aspect of ancient thought. You know, we tend to think, obviously, you know, I mean, most of us are Westerners. Westerners think in terms of monotheism. You know, we think within a Judeo-Christian framework, and that's perfectly understandable. But the ancients didn't necessarily think in terms of that framework. They would certainly speak, and I'm speaking of the Egyptians and the Greek Egyptians, they would speak of nous, or of a higher mind, a central great intellect from which everything emanated. But at the same time, without necessarily feeling that one teaching conflicted with another, they also saw energies as distinct emotional and ethical personalities which could be appealed to, which could be petitioned, with which you could form relationships. And all of this is implicit within the Hermetic literature. And I personally believe that when we look back upon the thought of ancient people, you know, we're very taken with their prowess for mathematics, astronomy, engineering, architecture, art, aesthetics, statuary, bas reliefs, irrigation, agriculture. These empires were around for a long, long time. I mean, even if you follow the traditional timeline, about which I have questions, and I write about elsewhere, you know, what we call ancient Egypt, even by the most conservative traditional timeline, was around for well over 3,500 years, and I believe a lot longer than that. I write about my perspective on that in a forthcoming book called The Seeker's Guide to the Secret Teachings of All Ages. It's my introductory volume to Manly Hall's book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. You know, but even if you go by the most conservative timeline, Egyptian civilization was around for longer than all of modern civilization. When the Greek historian Herodotus encountered the pyramids, they were as old to him as Herodotus is to us. So, it's no small thing to talk about the arts and sciences of Egyptian culture. That civilization was around vastly longer than we've been around. We as a modern world, I mean, if you count the centuries since, say, the fall of Rome, and you use even the most conservative timeline, Egypt was around twice as long as anything that we understand. So my reason for saying this is that if we marvel at the engineering, the calendrics, the architecture, the agriculture of the ancient world, why would we not linger more fully over their psychological and spiritual insights? Why do we possess this certainty, which is really just a repetition of an opinion that somebody else formed, that their form of theistic awareness doesn't hold anything for us? Obviously, we can't revive exactly the ancient temple orders, but we make our own efforts. We make our own efforts to connect with the primeval thought of the ancients. Look, what else is Freemasonry? I mean, Freemasonry is an effort to continue to practice custodianship over the initiatory rites and rituals and tools of ethical development that our ancient ancestors were possessed of. No liturgy in the modern world, whatever it is, has come down to us unblemished. I grew up in a very observant Jewish household. I had an Orthodox bar mitzvah. Now, the Jewish liturgy is very beautiful and very powerful, but it goes back primarily to the Middle Ages, as we practice it today. The Catholic Mass, very, very late antiquity, and it's no longer conducted in Latin, obviously. So, it's not as if anything that we participate in the world today hasn't been remade and reworked in a whole variety of ways. So I don't think we have a burden on us that, because the temple orders and priesthoods of the ancient world are gone, well, we're just lost. We can't experiment with or regain any of this stuff. The Hermetica is your entry point to that. It's your entry point to that. It's what we possess, with some other things besides. I would say don't neglect it. It could be, in some regards, the birth of an incredible path for us all. And if I speak about this in a way that sounds sort of as if something is being discovered, it's because, as I was alluding earlier, ours is the first generation that really has, the first English-speaking generation, that really has these quality translations. And I don't think we should neglect that. I think we should view ourselves as very fortunate and very privileged to have these translations. It gives us a springboard for experiment that people did not necessarily have in the early 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century. So I would say seize that opportunity. And what I've described about the spiritual psychology of the Hermetic literature might sound to some of you a lot like New Thought or mind causation. You could in some ways see Hermeticism as an ancestor to New Thought, this idea that thoughts are causative, an idea that's very important to me and that has dominated a great deal of my search for the past 15, 20 years or so. I read about this in the Miracle Club and a variety of other books. I take very seriously the contention that thoughts are causative. And I spoke earlier of the fact that there are sometimes parallel insights between philosophies that don't necessarily belong to the same family tree of influence. It would be making one leap too many to call Hermeticism the forefather of New Thought. The reason for that is that the pioneers of New Thought grew out of a very exciting atmosphere within the transcendental writings and searchings of New England, primarily, starting in the mid-19th century and developing into the latter 19th century into what we eventually came to call New Thought. But they didn't have access necessarily to translations of the Hermetic literature. There were very, very few to begin with. Many of the pioneers of New Thought grew up in rural circumstances in New England where there were very few books. You might have had scripture and just a few other really traditional books in your household, and then you might have experimented with mesmerism, mental healing, prayer healing, other things. But a lot of the pioneers of New Thought arrived at their insights through experimentation of their own. It's important to realize, apropos of what I've been saying, that things that we see as widely available today in translation were just not widely available even as recently as a few generations ago. Today, if you want to read an English translation of the Tao Te Ching, you have a vast array of translations to choose from, many of them really good. But the first English translation of the Tao Te Ching did not appear until 1838, and even then it was partial. So you put Tao Te Ching into Google today and take your pick of 100 translations, many of which are good. But the first English translation didn't even appear in partial form until 1838. The first English translation of the Bhagavad Gita wasn't really available even in years following that. In about 1845, there were probably about 5 editions, believe it or not, about 5 editions of an English language version of the Bhagavad Gita available in the United States. One was in the library at Harvard. One was in Ralph Waldo Emerson's personal library, which he loaned out to Henry David Thoreau. And 3 were in private hands. And that's it. Just imagine. I mean, here it is, 1845. The transcendental literature is developing, the literature that eventually gives birth to the development of New Thought, Christian Science, modalities that today we might call law of attraction, not a term that I personally use, power of positive thinking, things like that. And while the transcendentalists were influenced by Vedic thought, your average everyday person, or even your exceptional person, couldn't get his or her hands on a copy of the Bhagavad Gita in 1845. So we can't project backwards from our experience onto the experience of even fairly recent generations. This stuff simply was not available. So that's why we have to be really careful when we find similarities between the Hermetic literature and New Thought. We have to be careful not to leap to the conclusion, wow, New Thought goes back to ancient Egypt. Not exactly. But what's remarkable is that sometimes ancient and modern people will have parallel insights. And that, to me, as I mentioned earlier, is a very valuable scent trail of truth. If someone from antiquity and someone from the mid to late 19th century is hitting upon a similar idea, a similar framework, the same can be said also of Emanuel Swedenborg, going back several generations earlier from the New Thoughters, then I think it's just a commonality of experience. And that's valuable. That, to me, is a place to really start digging, to really start looking. Now, the Hermetic literature is also very helpful to me in another way, which is that for me personally, it helps explain some of the contradictions that exist within New Thought. The premise of New Thought is that mind is causative, thoughts are causative. And some of the New Thought figures who I most love, particularly Neville Goddard, who's tattooed over here, teach that everything emanates from your mind, that your mind is the ultimate tool of creation, that your mind is actually the God of Scripture, and that everything that you experience is a product of your emotionalized thoughts, outpictured, pushed out into the world. So then one could ask the question, okay, as profoundly exciting as that is, and as tantalizingly convincing as that is, not only based on the testimony of seekers, but based on ideas that emerge from psychical research, neuroplasticity, quantum theory, why then is there this concrete persistence of tragedy, of suffering, of physical decline, which to me is undeniable? I will never accept the premise that the human being is responsible for horrific suffering in atmospheres that might otherwise be suffused with hope and possibility. I've often asked myself about, as I'm sure many of you have, that if you accept the validity of mind causation, then why are there so many examples to the contrary? Am I just dwelling within delusion? Am I just peddling, ideas that are cherry-picked from my own experience? I don't think so. I think there's more to it than all that, which will be the topic of a different talk and which I've written broadly about elsewhere. But the Hermetic literature also makes the case that while we, the individuals, can create as the higher mind creates, as above, so below, we are limited within the concentric framework that we find ourselves. As the psalmist says, we shall die as princes. Ye are as gods, but you shall die as princes. Many meanings to that. But one of the meanings I take from it comports with Hermeticism, which is this idea that we are still conscripted to exist within the physical and material boundaries that we find within this realm of existence, even if mind, nous, is the ultimate principle of life, which I believe to be true. We are many gradations separated from that ultimate principle of life, as there are gradations who are separated from us, wherever it is that we might be within this concentric framework. And we have to abide by and accept the physical limitations, including mortality, obviously, that we face within this framework. But through the indestructible capacity of mind, we can begin, so the Hermetic literature teaches, to rise up through this framework, and that at moments of ultimate and exquisite awareness, we are freed. Not just through death, but at moments of ultimate awareness and sensitivity, we are freed. The Hermetic literature teaches that through thought, you can travel unimaginable distances. You can dialogue with the gods. You can be loosed from physical limitations. So we're not locked into a situation where we're incapable of gaining glimpses of higher circles of existence. But we do ultimately have to obey the laws of physicality that we encounter within this circle. Although we also have the possibility, as glimpsed in moments of awareness, to rise up ultimately through different incarnations, through higher circles of mind, and the very awareness of these cosmic correspondences that we participate in, strengthen them in our lives, So within the Hermetic literature, you also find an acknowledgement of humanity's limits. You find a description of yourself as a cosmic being, but also a description of yourself as a physical being. And one of the reasons that I admire the Kabalyan so much and that I recommend it as a work to study side by side with the more traditional Hermetic literature is that the author of the Kabalyan did a wonderful job of distilling into a psychological language that we recognize today some of the insights of the Hermetic literature, particularly in his theories of correspondence, polarity, and rhythm. In a sense, correspondence, polarity, and rhythm, as described in the Kabalyan, are really the methodology of as above, so below. Correspondence being the idea that everything is grouped into a kind of framework of opposition, a yin and yang, an above and below, not as dualistic or separate parts, but as one whole. Everything that is a thing has within itself its own opposites. Everything is a kind of pairing of opposites. And the theory of polarity, as described in this book, is that everything can actually become its opposite. Everything exists on a sliding scale. So, for example, we see this all the time in politics. A revolution that's intended to liberate eventually hardens into some new form of oppression that may have been worse than what it was intended to replace. And this is also true emotionally. Our emotions exist on a sliding scale of polarity, so that, for example, love and hate, depression and enthusiasm, fear and cowardice, hopefulness and despair exist on a kind of sliding scale. And the contention that the author of the Kabalyan makes, and I encourage you to experiment with this, is that if you are feeling a certain emotion, whatever it is, say it's fear, that you find profoundly difficult or disabling, and you want to transmute it, you want to alchemically transmute it, if you can identify its polar opposite, through focus on that polar opposite, you will be able to slide the scale from, we'll say, negative to positive, yin to yang, passive to active. The pivotal factor is being able to identify the opposing polarity of whatever emotion it is that you want to transform. You can't transform something that's unrelated into something else. You can't transform happiness into courage. You know, they're not polar opposites. The idea is that if you can accurately identify the emotional reality of the polar opposite by an act of focus in and of itself, you are capable of sliding that polarity. And in fact, it's happening all the time, which is what's described in the law or the principle of rhythm. Life is pendulous. Life is compensatory. Things are constantly going back and forth, back and forth. That's a very important principle. It suggests the idea that everything that befalls you in life is wed to a counterpoint. And so William Blake made the observation, opposition is true friendship. Opposition is true friendship. Or as Nietzsche famously put it, that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. As the Kabalyan puts it, rhythm compensates. It's this idea that if something challenging or difficult befalls you, that's the very thing that fortifies you. That's the very thing that strengthens you. I always tell people, you know, be very careful about wishing that you could go backwards and undo some difficult circumstance in life, because maybe that's possible. You know, if the mind has the cosmic qualities attributed to it by the Hermetic literature, if time as we know it is illusory, which it certainly is. I mean, it's been demonstrated that time bends according to speed in extreme conditions and circumstances. It's been demonstrated that objects on the particle scale exist in an infinite number of places at once until someone takes a measurement, which actually wreaks havoc on the idea of there being a neat linear before, during, and after. If time is infinite, it may be possible that the wish to undo something in your past that you view as difficult, as traumatic, maybe it's something that we're acting on all the time. Maybe we do undo these things, but we're not aware of undoing them because every event carries with it a kind of non-linear, multi-dimensional sense of reality, so that when things change, everything else changes with them, and it seems very natural and orderly and plain. The things that you have suffered in life, the difficulties, the betrayals, the humiliations, whatever it may be, those are the very things that have fostered and fomented in you the most mature traits that you possess today, the traits that you're most proud of today. It's difficult, it's painful, but friction is the price of growth. Friction is the price of creativity. As above, so below. If life is rhythmic, if life is pendulous, if life is a movement in between polarities, and this is going on naturally and always, just as the sun rises and sets, just as a tide ebbs and flows, just as plants bloom and wither, then it stands to reason that everything in life is in a kind of rhythmic, tense, necessary harmony. And that wherever suffering you are experiencing today is precedent to growth and possibility and development tomorrow. Maybe much sooner than you think. Watch for this. Be very intent about watching for this. You know, it's not uncommon that you can experience something very difficult in life, and at least in my personal experience, which I don't think could be exceptional, you might find the rhythmic compensation, the rhythmic counterpart, comes more quickly and more clearly than you think. Sometimes things are much further away. But when John Lennon sang about instant karma, I don't think he was just coining a pretty phrase. I think there's something there. It doesn't cover everything, that's to be sure. There are events that are tragic, catastrophic, confounding, and it can be very hard to see the rhythmic polarity of an event, but not always. Within the intimate structure of your life, you can very often discover and discern rhythmic counterparts, and it can help you understand William Blake's statement that opposition is true friendship, or it can help you understand that Nietzsche wasn't just demonstrating some sort of aphoristic bluster when he said what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. There's wisdom there that goes back to the Hermetic insight, as above, so below. And so finally, I want to close with this idea. We have in our possession in this generation translations for English-speaking people of the Hermetic literature that were unavailable to previous generations. We've been given a gift. We must, I believe, accept that gift. When you're offered a gift, accept it. And within that gift, I believe you can discover the kind of primeval insights in psychology that I think our forebears in the Renaissance hoped for and didn't hope in vain. Even though the insights might have arrived in a package that was late ancient, the insights themselves, I think, resound with some of the profoundest, earliest insights of an extraordinary empire and religious framework that existed for thousands of years, longer than anything that we understand today in modern life. And that the core insight of the Hermetica, which is available to us, tells us that in the vein of as above, so below, we are able to create within this cosmic framework, in as much as we have been created, and we are limited by the physical parameters of the cosmic framework that we're in, but those limits are not ultimate. We are freed from them at moments of exquisite awareness, and we are eventually freed from them in different incarnations and the possibilities of rising up through different spheres of existence. We may have risen up through different spheres of existence to occupy this sphere that we're in right now. And as you explore the Hermetic literature, I want to reiterate one possibility that I hope you will embrace and you will work with if you're so moved. And it is this. There are invariably times in life where no matter what tools we have been given from a spiritual or ethical perspective, we feel absolutely crushed by the stresses and difficulties of life. All of us today are living through a pandemic, a lockdown that has had just devastating consequences on economy, livelihood, in some cases health, physical and psychological. And we can only guess, when it's going to end. And I know how deeply this wears upon people. And I know how deeply it wears upon me. And I think there are times in life where circumstances, both intimate and macro, just make us feel absolutely crushed. And I've often said to people that when you wake up at 4 in the morning and you're staring at the ceiling and you can't sleep, insights about compensatory rhythm are not necessarily comforting. They're not necessarily helpful then. But I think that we are given an escape hatch. And I think that escape hatch comes in the form of what is sometimes called prayer, or what I would call forging a relationship with the deific energies that our ancestors referred to as the gods. I've made the reference before that we marvel at so many of the insights, mechanisms, arts, and sciences of our ancient forebears, but I believe we have, while we've honored their parables and their insights and their ethics, I think we have neglected some of their spiritual modalities, which could be useful to us today. When I say spiritual, I mean simply extra-physical. There's no doubt in my mind that our existence is both physical and extra-physical. Again, as above, so below, the core insight of the Hermetic literature. My encouragement to you, if this suggestion resonates, is to consider, based upon the wealth of insight, information, testimony, esoteric philosophy that's available to us today in unprecedented forms. If there's a deific figure from the ancient past, it could be Thoth, it could be Hermes, it could be Athena, it could be Minerva, it could be Jupiter, it could be Diana, it could be Maat, it could be any deific figure that we understand from the annals of antiquity today that resonates with you and that you feel a sense of ethical, spiritual, psychological connection to, for whatever reason. It doesn't rest upon some rational analysis. For whatever reason, I would encourage you to consider seeking a relationship with that figure through prayer, dialogue, petition, veneration. See what you find. It's an experiment. It's your own intimate experiment. You don't have to go broadcasting it to the world. In fact, I suggest not doing so. Why put yourself in a position where people will say, what are you doing? This is your intimate experiment. That's what's so wonderful about it. It's something simply to try. I was moved to tears many years ago when I read for the first time an English translation of the Hermetic Dialogue known as Asclepius. Within Asclepius, if you read it, as I hope you will, it's quite short, you will find an extraordinary and accurate prophecy of ancient Egypt's decline. And I used it as the epigraph to my first book, Occult America. And it reads, "O Egypt, Egypt, there will remain of thy religion only fables." It was an accurate decline. It was an accurate prophecy of ancient Egypt's decline. But as above, so below. Embedded with and married to that prophecy is also a prophecy of the revival of the ancient gods, the revival of the ancient gods. Now, I don't mean to be overly portentous with you. I don't mean to wax overly dramatic, but I would make the observation, again, that ours is the first English-speaking generation that possesses really legitimate, accessible translations of the Hermetic literature. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be able to quote those lines to you about Egypt's decline, about Egypt's revival. So is it possible? Is it possible that the first half of the prophecy was accurate in as much as the second half of the prophecy is accurate? But it's not going to just happen in some thunderbolt way. It's not going to just happen in some way that fits my mind's eye picture, just in the same way that the primeval theology didn't reach Renaissance scholars necessarily in a way that fit their mind's eye picture. The form in which it reached them came from late antiquity rather than deepest antiquity, but it was legitimate nonetheless. Maybe, given that our generation, for all the challenges that we face, possesses these insights and the availability of this literature, which was not available to our forebears, maybe it falls to us to act on this gift, to act on this gift. So the possibility of Hermes resurrected may very well exist within you. It's not necessarily heralding of the building of a new temple or the establishment of a new religion. I think we've probably had enough of that, or the creation of a new priestly class, or something like that. Not necessarily something that's overtly dramatic, but maybe intimately dramatic. So if what I've described to you this evening is moving, then I ask you to begin your own study of Hermetic literature and consider the question of whether forging a relationship with the ancients, including the ancient deific energies, is something that could permeate you, help you, bring you awareness, bring you possibilities. And perhaps ours is the age of Hermes resurrected. So with that, I thank you all very, very much. It's been a great pleasure and privilege to speak with you. And we certainly do have some time. I've gone on for a long time, but we certainly do have some time for questions. And I'm very happy to stick around and to hear from you and to continue our dialogue. Thank you.
Mitch, thank you so much. That was incredible. And you really brought up something that I think is very, very key. The history and the movement of the Corpus Hermetica through history, from Greece through Cosimo de' Medici, the monk, I believe his name was Leonardo de Pastorio. But, these things are so integral. And if you really think about it in context, what was the driving force in Italy and pretty much all of Europe during the 1460s, during this time? And that was the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So for so much attention to be attributed to the Hermetic texts, absolutely incredible. I mean, that would be equivalent of a New York Times bestseller today.
Right. It's funny. If you go to the Vatican, you find depictions of Hermes Trismegistus, Mercury. You'll find an image of Hermes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. There was a very, within certain reaches of the Catholic Church, there was a veneration for pre-Christian thought. Not a condemnation, but a feeling that, this was humanity using what insights it had available to it, and there were a number of Christian theologians who felt that Hermes, the philosophy of Hermes, foresaw or was a precursor to Christian philosophy. Obviously, one could debate that, but the church was guardedly accepting of some of this literature at the time. Guardedly.
So I want to ask you about the documentary you filmed. You mentioned the
Caballon. Yeah.
I know that really ties in really tightly with our discussion this evening. Hermetic text. And by the way, I want to personally thank you. You turned me on to Neville Goddard. And absolutely blown away. He's one of my heroes now. But as far as the Kabalyan and the principles there and your trip to Egypt, would you like to talk about that just a little bit?
Sure. The director, Ronnie Thomas, and I are shooting a documentary called The Kabalyan, and it's about the Hermetic roots of the Kabalyan, a book that years ago I would have dismissed as just a novelty of early 20th century occultism, but that I came to realize more recently is a really solid distillation and retention of certain Hermetic ideas. And because the book has been shrouded in so much drama and mystery since it was published in 1908, and because it really does have, I think, real weight and depth and validity as a text, and there's sort of this dramatic historical backstory behind it, I thought it would be wonderful to do a documentary that really looked at its backstory, its backdrop, and its relevance, and how Hermetic insights underscore so much of our spiritual culture today. So that is what the documentary is about. We shot part of it last year in Egypt, actually, in February of 2019. And Ronnie and I just finished shooting the final parts here in New York City, where I am, about maybe 4 weeks ago, and he is editing it right now. My hope is that it is going to be ready for distribution, maybe, I'm going to say, early next year. And I'm just very excited by it, and it's a dream come true to have been able to work on it. So I'll be sharing further news about it on social media.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to it. I cannot wait to see it.
Thank you.
You told me a little bit about it last year, and I've just been, really anticipating that.
Yeah.
So if anyone has any questions for Mitch, we have a little time, so
please
feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions. And if you're not asking a question or dialoguing with Mitch, please keep yourself on mute. But otherwise, please unmute yourself and ask away.
Yeah, I actually do have a question. Waiting to see if I'm interrupting anybody. I think we're good. Mitch, you had talked about like kind of the correlation between Thoth, Hermes, and Mercury. Is there, and you'd mentioned it briefly, a tie to Abraham or Moses within the Bible and Christian literature, or is that more that he's a contemporary of them?
Oh, well, it's more like a folk belief. In the Renaissance, the speculation was that Hermes Trismegistus may have been a contemporary of Moses or Abraham, a teacher of Moses and Abraham. The idea was that Hermes was seen as this great deific man god, and that Hermes was the teacher of humanity. So insofar as the Western mind saw Moses and Abraham as kind of the progenitors of Judeo-Christianity, Hermes was seen as their progenitor. You know, it was more of a folk belief, you know, of the era, you know, than an actual connection, I would say.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And, you know, that's Josh Romero who just spoke, and Josh has been creating the wonderful graphics that accompany the postings for these talks. And so I just really want to thank him, because we live in a visual age, and, you know, if it weren't for his graphics, I don't think that we'd be able to assemble these talks as effectively as we had. So a real thank you to Josh Romero. And
Thanks.
to Matt Parker, because convening these talks, I mean, this is our second one, and I look forward to more. It's really been wonderful. So I really want to thank Matt Parker and all the, you know, Masonic fraternities that make up the North Carolina Research Society. It's very meaningful.
Well, Mitch, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I mean,
Yeah.
It's just an honor for you to speak to us. This is actually,
Thank you.
you've spoken to us once in person, and now
Right.
twice.
And that was the trip.
And,
right.
Yeah, it was absolutely fantastic. And by the way, anybody that's interested, Mitch gives the best hugs of anyone I know. It's incredible. But
Not during the pandemic.
Not during the pandemic, right?
We'll do it virtually. It's okay.
It's a lost art. I'm sorry?
We'll do it virtually. That's
right,
fine.
virtually, right.
Right. But, you know, it's interesting when we talk about the history of the Corpus Hermetica. And by the way, I love that you quoted a part of the book of Asclepius.
Yeah.
Actually, that section is commonly referred to as the Lament of Hermes. So that's a good way to Google that and read that entirety. But it really is very eerily accurate to our modern time.
Mm-hmm.
It says that the gods depart Earth.
Yeah.
That the wise man will be thought to be a fool. Basically, that wrong and injustice will be deemed to be normal, and the wise man. Anyway, the analogy or the story there depicted in the book of Asclepius is just absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah.
That at that time in Egypt, they were really going through maybe a similar thing there, and they saw that coming. But I just thought that was incredible, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a heartbreaking lament. It's an absolutely heartbreaking lament, and you know, I fell to my knees, you know, in front of it. I mean, that's why I made it the epigraph to Occult America. You know, I mean, it's this sense of a whole corpus of wisdom, you know, slipping away because the binding agents of the ancient world, you know, were coming apart. But again, what's so incredible, and how could our ancestors have foreseen, you know, that we today living a life that would have been as alien to them as theirs is to us, you know, are capable of reading these thoughts and ethically communing with them. And that's something that should be approached with real veneration.
Hey, Mitch, I have a question.
Yeah.
Have you encountered anything that the reason why they named the Kabalyan?
No, I haven't. I think, you know, my best guess. All right, my best guess is that it's a Hellenized version of Kabbalah. Sorry.
Yes, I found that it comes from the word Kabbalah, but the word on from Hellenapolis.
Oh,
Yeah. So
Yeah. I think it's a Hellenic variant of Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I was going to say, you ever heard of Zosimos of Panopolis?
Oh, yeah.
And he says that, you know, he has a book called The Alpha and Omega, which is a very thin book because, you know, some of his works has been kind of destroyed and lost in time until they found the Arabic version.
Yes.
And he says that the the Thoth, to the Hebrews, they call him Adam, and to some they call him David.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
I have not read that tract, but that's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. He says, "You're very welcome." Yeah, he just says they called him Adam for the Adam, meaning it stands for the ascendant, which for air, the A, and then the D stands for descendant, because it's the earth, and then the M stands for the meridian. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'll read that. I'll track that down. Thank you.
I've got a couple of questions, but first I'll echo your thanks to Matt and Josh and anyone else involved in putting this together. You expressed at one point some caution in drawing a connection between, at least a direct connection between Hermeticism and movements like New Thought or the Transcendental Movement and so on. But is it safe to say that there was at least a pretty significant latent connection? In other words, had it not been for the Hermetic revival during the Renaissance, that some of those ideas probably wouldn't have occurred in the way that they did a few centuries later?
Yeah, I think that's fair. You know, I think that's fair. I often refer to them as parallel insights, but I think you're making a very good point. You know, even though I say they're parallel insights, it would be going too far to say, well, you know, there's no connection. I mean, yes, you know, you did have a Hermetic revival during the Renaissance. You did have within the work of Bronson Alcott, in fact, one of Bronson Alcott's first lectures as part of, in fact, I think his first lecture, if I'm remembering right, as part of Emerson's Transcendental Club, was on the theme of Hermes. And it was from the transcendental literature that I would say the field was planted, that eventually grew into, you know, what became New Thought, Christian Science, mental healing, a whole host of metaphysical philosophies that grew in the wake of transcendentalism. So, you know, I mean, there are DNA strands of influence. Yeah, I mean, one has to be really careful because it's an indirect family tree, and we're talking about, you know, a thread that gets interrupted, and people are experiencing it perhaps indirectly through the work of the transcendentalists, but the influence is there, you know, and I'd be wrong to say, you know, it was just completely parallel lines. You know, there's tissue of connection for sure. Yeah. Okay.
My second question has to do with, well, first of all, I gained sort of an obsessive interest in Hermeticism a few years ago, several years ago, including a couple years before I discovered your work. But it's always a pleasure to listen to you and, for one, receive some kind of validation or vindication that my understanding of Hermeticism is accurate to the extent that I've looked into it as much as you have, which are far beyond me, but I hope to get there someday. But while listening to you talk today, I had a thought that as far as the Byzantine trajectory of esotericism, let's call it, it's often noted that it's less interrupted as the Western trajectory. So what we call the Renaissance was this rediscovery of things that weren't necessarily lost in the same way that they were in the Eastern Roman tradition. Do you have a sense of how prominent Hermeticism remained within what they call the Greek East, and to what degree that population was aware of that influence?
Well, that's a tough question. You know, it's a very interesting observation, and I think what you're describing is absolutely right on. But there are intervening factors that make it difficult. You know, I mean, first of all, you know, some Hermetic work, including the Emerald Tablet itself, reaches us in its oldest form in Arabic. Works like the Picatrix, which really served as the astrological basis for Cornelius Agrippa's books of occult philosophy, that existed, has come down to us in Arabic. So, we can see the persistence and the vouch keeping of Hermetic works in Middle Eastern, Near Eastern languages. Some of the influences that, ironically enough, I think that were of Egyptian in nature may have been felt more fully in the Hellenic world, only because the Hellenic world made a very ready and full embrace of Egyptian and North African wisdom and ideas when it found it. The Persian world, had influences that were equally ancient and were sort of freestanding of their own accord. And the disillusion that was felt in the West, was also felt in the East, even though the Roman Empire persisted. And then with the advent of Islam, you had a prior advent of Christianity, including Coptic Christianity. And then with the advent of Islam, I think it was difficult for those influences to be sustained, above ground in any way. So although, there are certainly pristine examples, I think the Hermetic tradition in the East, met with unique challenges of its own.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me that the Arabic tradition, of course, was more probably explicit in its continuation of that tradition.
Yeah,
and of course,
late ancient literature.
Yeah, and then of course influenced the West around the same time, and probably even earlier than when Hermeticism came back in.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Hey, Mitch,
I got another
one. I'm sorry. One comment. One, kind of like Manly P. Hall, you never have to refer to notes. You're just it's just a consciousness that keeps coming out, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So what I noticed in this whole thing here, that the thing you repeated over and over was as above, so below.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you think of the macro and the micro, and in my head, I think of that as an intelligent design that ripples, from the cosmos and the nebulae to cellular structure and everything else. How do you feel about that? Do you feel that there's an intelligent design that goes from the macro to the micro, and that's part of who we are and what our universe is all about?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I mean, that's one of the great questions of human life. I suppose I would say I come at it this way. I'm really interested myself in ESP research, and one of the things that fuels my interest in ESP research, scholarly, juried ESP research, is that I think the best of it in the 20th and early 20th century has demonstrated that we human beings do lead some sort of an extra-physical existence. ESP researchers have demonstrated the anomalous transfer of information in laboratory settings. People, certain subjects, and sometimes pools of subjects show the ability to glean information either from another person or information from some image that's not shown to them in a way that's accessible to the ordinary senses, in a way that we cannot explain by our normal sensory existence. So, talk about as above, so below. If you start from that perspective and you accept, as I do, that we have legitimate, defended, successful statistical evidence for humanity having an extra-physical existence, it opens us up into this incredible range of questions. Well, then what about bodily death? And if intelligence is non-local, then what is its point of emanation, and I mean, all these amazing questions. And it may not be given to our generation to ever be able to answer these questions. It may not be given to any generation, but what a shame it would be, if we neglected this, because I think that once we have evidence of an extra physical existence, and you could say testimony is evidence enough, and I honor that, but we have testimony and we also have more. And once we have that, it just opens up onto incredible questions. Who are we? We're obviously more than just flesh, bone, and cognition. And it's hilarious to me. I mean, the philosophy of materialism, philosophical materialism, is basically that matter creates itself. Matter creates itself. And the truth is, that just doesn't hold up, in the 21st century anymore. People... now and again, I'll hear from academics who are materialists, and they'll say, well, there's no proof for non-local intelligence. And I'll say to them, look, not only is there proof for non-local intelligence, but you're unaware of elements of your own scientific method that undermine the argument you're making to me. And so to some extent, you're just asserting a preference, and materialism as a philosophy is probably going to linger for a long time, but it simply no longer covers the bases of life anymore. And we're going to have to adjust to that. I mean, I kind of believe that, we as a generation, and maybe it'll be the next generation, I don't know, but I think we're on the precipice of a new conception of human nature, because quantum theory, neuroplasticity, psychical research, even the furthest edges of placebo response studies are exposing us to things that don't fit within the materialist paradigm. So I think we're on the precipice of something, and we can't run away from it. It's remarkable.
Yeah, I tend to agree that we're heading to some higher plane, and it's going to be a tough road, a tough road to hoe. But
Yeah,
but
sure.
I think we're heading that way.
Yeah, thank you, Al. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Okay. So anyone
hello.
have any questions for Mitch? Go right ahead.
Hi, how's it going? Matt
Hey.
Parker and Mitch Horowitz. It's a pleasure and an honor, and thank you everyone who
Thank
got
you.
this going together.
Thank you.
Also, thank you to Josh. This promotion is nothing but just amazing works.
Right on.
Mitch, I've been following you for quite some time now, man, and thank you so much for always taking the time
Thank
due to your
you.
busy schedule. And
Absolutely.
this information today, man, was nothing but mind-opening, and I'm just curious, do you intend to inquire? I know you usually do, but do you intend to intertwine maybe like some of your past, if you will, like your spiritual findings or your recent search, intertwine it with the information that you provided with us today?
Oh, well, I have a book out where I do some of that. I mentioned a book earlier called the Kabalyan Study Guide, and I'm actually really proud of that book. It came out fairly recently, and in that book, I have a new, really substantial introduction, afterword, and chapter notes where I explored the spiritual teachings and the psychological teachings of the Kabalyan, and I relate them both to Hermetic literature, to aspects of my own search, and to some of the developments in science that Al and I were discussing. And I was reviewing that book in preparation for tonight's talk, and I'm really proud of it. I feel like it does a nice job of marrying some of the things we were talking about. So that's one instance where I've done that, and I'll continue to work in that direction.
Yeah, your speech about the dark alternative was nothing but mind-opening as well.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Intertwine that together. That's pretty what I was also inquiring about. But,
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That is, that's part of my journey in exploring this question of relating to energies, and I use the term energies, kind of metaphorically, but also not quite metaphorically. If we accept that our ancient ancestors had insights into nature that are uniquely different from and in some ways profounder than our own, including how you, the individual, relates to the surrounding world and the surrounding cosmos. And they personified some of these energies and sought relations with them. One of them is over my left shoulder, appropriately enough, and that's the figure of Set, and that's from Egypt, actually. And I think that seeking a relationship with those energies in whatever form can be so revelatory. So that's what I was exploring in that lecture, and I'll definitely, continue to explore that. I mean, that's a very important part of my search. Yeah.
Can't thank you enough, man. Excuse my connection. I'm trying to deal with the rainstorms and lightning out here.
All of us, yeah. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks.
By the way, that was a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it.
We have time for one or two more.
Okay.
See, Mitch, they're just stunned. They're just
all right. Well, it's all good. It's just a pleasure, to speak with everybody. I want to reiterate that in terms of your own study, I would get hold of one of the translations that I recommended, Hermetica by Brian Copenhaver, or The Way of Hermes by Clement Salmon and other translators, or both. I have no connection to either of those books. I just admire them. I recommend reading them in full. The Copenhaver introduction is particularly helpful. If you feel that you really want to kind of dive right in and get to some of the mystical heart of what we've been talking about, the books I specifically suggest that you read, and when I say books, these are very short tracts. I mean, these are things that we today would call pamphlet length. The tracts that I think you should look at are books 1, books 11, and Asclepius. Books 1, books 11, and Asclepius. Those, I believe, are the real mystical heart of the Hermetica. And also check out the Kabalyan, because I do believe that the author of the Kabalyan made a really, really wonderful distillation of some of the psychological ideas. If you are so moved, my Kabalyan study guide unites the insights of this book with some of what we've been talking about. And I'm eager to hear from all of you, what you discover, because again, ours is really the first generation, English-speaking generation, that I think has this material so readily available to it. So let's use it together. And thank you.
Mitch, thank you. And speaking of recommendations, everyone, pick up some of Mitch's books. Mitch, brilliant stuff. Occult America. Any of these are fantastic books, and I just cannot.
Oh, Infinite Potential. Yeah.
I cannot recommend them enough.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I know I don't have all of your books, but one day I will. And I'm so I'm so honored to even have a few copies that you were kind enough to autograph for me. So that
well, it's a pleasure, and believe me, as soon as this lockdown lifts, I'm Greensboro bound, and I can't wait.
Please,
so
I'd love to have you.
I'd be delighted. Thank you.
Absolutely. One last thing. We have just a couple minutes, so just one last thing I'd like to throw out there is the Masonic Connection, because interestingly enough, if you don't believe it or not, Mitch, I had a question from someone on Facebook earlier today when I published the link for registering for this event. A brother responded. He said, "Well, what does this have to do with Masonry?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "What doesn't it have to do with Masonry?"
Right, exactly. I mean,
our rituals are so hermetic in origin, and if you look at the history, like you so adequately explained the origin of the Corpus Hermetica, which I believe was an oral tradition. Which when the Greeks established the city of Alexandria, they took these oral stories and just reduced them to writing.
Yes.
They just meant oral traditions before. So I do think the Greeks did a very good job of capturing that. The one last question I have to you is about the philosophy of Mott. So for those that say that the Hermetica is more Greek than it is Egyptian, I, as a retaliation, point to the philosophy of Mott, or the principle of Mott.
Yeah.
Look, there it is. There it is.
Right. Every age reinterprets the ancient traditions that it finds. As I was saying earlier, I mean, the Jewish liturgy, even though, Judaism goes to deepest antiquity, the liturgy itself is from the Middle Ages. It's going to bear the markings of different ages and eras, and the Hermetic literature is no exception. It's authentically Egyptian. But of course, it's going to bear the markings of some of the scribes who wrote it down. That's just human nature. And apropos of your friend on Facebook, I mean, of course, the greatness of Freemasonry is that it's preserved the initiatory tradition, which stems from, the mystery traditions of ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, and, the Hellenic culture saw Egypt as its progenitor in terms of much of its spiritual thought, honoring Egyptian gods with their own titles, such as Hermes Trismegistus, and we're looking at the roots of the initiatory tradition, which has been preserved in Freemasonry. Masonry has practiced custodianship over this tradition. So this is our roots.
I have a question. Just one little thing, Mitch.
Please.
It is said that the Emerald Tablets supposedly was found by Alexander, correct? And there was no proof that he actually found this Emerald Tablet, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right, and apparently it's an esoteric. The emerald is an esoteric symbolic symbol of Venus. And the alchemists claim that is the secret of the Emerald Tablet, because it has to do with Venus, right? And I don't know if you traced with Hermes with Hiram, which is in Masonry, right? Apparently Hermes, without the vowels, it's actually Hiram, and that his name Abif is not really part of his name. That it comes from apparently it comes from the French Befit, which means to eliminate. I don't know if you encountered that.
No, I haven't.
No,
I haven't. No, I mean, my interest in of course, one has to read the Emerald Tablet as it's come down to us, and it's an alchemical tract. I've spoken only of the psychological portion of it, but there's many different folds within it. And Isaac Newton, who gave us maybe the first, certainly the most enduring English translation, he was absolutely fascinated with it. And again, its antiquity was questioned, but I think now it's well established that the Emerald Tablet is authentic Hermetica.
Yeah, I agree. Apparently, there's a Coptic document that calls Thoth the thrice greatest.
Oh,
and
that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. And you can see the link between Thoth and Hermes now being called the thrice greatest. Yeah.
Oh, without question. Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. Cool. All right. Well, it's been a great night. I thank everybody. We're going to do another.
Yeah, absolutely. Mitch, you and I will get together. We'll
for real.
Set a date. This has been fantastic.
Thank you all.
I really appreciate everyone showing up.
Likewise.
Mitch is he's an outstanding historian, researcher, lecturer, author. And Mitch, you're also a horror film aficionado, I understand.
Well, I did participate in the first season of Cursed Films on Shudder, and there's a second season coming, I'm very happy to say. And so those of you who subscribe to Shudder can watch Cursed Films. It's a 5-part documentary series. You can also find some podcasts and interviews that I did with the director, Jay Cheel. And so that was a great experience. And season 2 is coming.
So I do have a question for you. It may be off the topic of the Hermetic text or the Corpus Hermetica, but in horror movies, do you see a correlation? I mean, these lessons that we are to learn or that we can study and learn more about ourselves or our own psyche.
Well, it's interesting. One of the points that I made in a number of the podcasts that Jay and I did and some of the interviews I did for Curse Films is that horror is probably the one genre that most closely coincides with belief, and a lot of our belief systems get reflected back to us in horror films, battles between good and evil. And, my contention is that, for example, a lot of us today wouldn't even know what an exorcism is if it wasn't for the release of the movie The Exorcist. These things, we have these mind's eye images of, what is exorcism, what is demon possession, and so on. But a lot of times, even if we haven't seen the movie, or even if we haven't seen the movie for many, many years, it affects our sense of belief. And I say that, with veneration. I mean, there's a lot of horror that coincides with people's most deeply felt belief systems. So it's the only genre, of which that is so. We look at science fiction, of course, and we say, well, maybe, someday. But horror tends to impact us in the here and now, and it reflects back to us our ideals, our fears, and in terms of lessons, I think probably the primary lesson of every horror movie is always hubris, the danger of hubris, which is also found, within the dialogues about civilizations like Atlantis, for example, maybe something we'll talk about in a future presentation.
Absolutely. And someone just commented in the comments that, Mitch, would you consider doing a talk on horror movies in October?
Oh, well, yes. How could you turn that down? How could you turn that down? Yeah. Given that, October is coming, what kind of a humbug would it be to say no to that? So.
No, but I think it would be great for some esotericism, just taking the concept of
I dig that.
classic horror movies and tying that into our psyches and the way we think and our philosophies, and being able to meditate on those concepts.
Yeah,
fantastic idea.
I'm very open to that. Yeah, cool.
Well, everyone, I want to thank everyone for
thank you
joining us this evening. Mitch, especially thank you to you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
For doing this. I mean, if anybody wants to know, this was Mitch's idea to do this, and I am just so grateful for him, sharing his time. He's a very busy man, has a lot on his plate, but the fact that you would make time for us, Mitch, just
thank you.
It means the world to me personally.
Pleasure for me. Thank you.
Really, really do appreciate that, and
absolutely.
It's an honor to call you my friend.
Likewise, for sure. Yeah. Thanks to all of you, and thank you, Matt and Josh and everybody who participated. It's a pleasure, and it won't be long before we do it again. Thank you.
So we'll do it again. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
So everyone,
talk soon.
Thank you for joining us tonight. This has been actually amazing presentation. It's blown my mind, as I'm sure seeing the comments, several other minds have been blown tonight. So, Mitch, we look forward to seeing you again. And
more soon.
Thank you.
For sure. Pleasure. Good night, everybody. Take care.
Have a great night.
Good night.
Good night, all.